Everyone, welcome to this lesson on the poem Remains by Simon Armitage. Please make sure you've got a copy of the poem to hand, a pen, some spare paper and also a highlighter if you've got one. Before we take a look at the poem, I'd like you to consider the words that you can see in the word cloud in front of you. What do you think this poem is going to be about based on the words that you can see? Once you've considered that, I'd like you to then pick 3 key words from that word cloud and annotate them with their word class and their connotations. And lastly, consider whether you can group the words from that word cloud in any way, and you may create as many categories as you like. Pause the video to give yourself time to complete these tasks and press play when you're ready. Armitage was born in 1963 in Huddersfield, Yorkshire. This contemporary poem, Remains, is taken from an anthology by Simon Armitage called The Not Dead and is actually based on the true story of a soldier who fought in the Iraq War. I'd like you to think about that title, The Not Dead. What are the connotations? What do you think it means? So Simon Armitage tells us these are poems of survivors, the damaged, exhausted men who return from war in body but never wholly in mind. Take a look at the images of the soldiers on the screen. How do you think conflict has taken its toll on these men? What changes can you see in their appearance? And what are your initial impressions on the power conflict has over these lives? Now, attached to the assignment, you'll see there's a link to enable you to watch a clip from The Not Dead. And in the clip, you'll meet the guardsman whose experience in Iraq actually inspired Armitage's poem. As you watch the clip, I'd like you to think about how conflict has affected him and what sort of emotions you think Armitage is going to present to us in Remains as a consequence. Now, considering all the activities that you've completed, what ideas or themes do you think Remains will explore? What do you think this poem is going to be about? Before we read the poem, it's important that you have a good grasp, a good understanding of PTSD. I'd like you to read through the information on the next couple of slides about this disorder and bullet point the information. Press pause on the video now to give yourself time to do that and then press play again when you're ready. Now that you have an improved or refreshed understanding of that disorder, I'd like you to read through the poem. As you read through, I'd like you to be considering what you feel it's about, what you notice about the language being used, how you can comment on the structure, and what's the message the poet is trying to convey. Pause the video to allow yourself to read through and then press play again when you're ready. Now let's take a look at the literal meaning of the first 2 quatrains. So here we have the speaker describing an occasion during war where he's been out with his unit and they have shot a looter. So a looter being somebody who is stealing goods. And then it moves on to describe the violence of the attack and the casual way in which the body is dealt with. And then we're clearly shown that the soldier is unable to get rid of this experience. He's unable to flush the memory out of his head. He's traumatized by it, suffering from PTSD. Now let's have a look at some of the key concepts and how they're presented to us. Firstly, war and the aftermath. So think about that soldier in the war zone, in that moment with his unit, and the way they casually shoot and deal with the body of the looter. And then think about how you can contrast that with the way once the soldier is home and on his own, how those horrific memories come back to haunt him. And Armitage also explores injustice of war and trauma and guilt. Remember, that looter who lost his life was potentially not dangerous, and that's evidenced by the repeated phrase, probably armed, possibly not. And the poet explores how those split decisions made in war about life or death can cause these traumatic memories to overwhelm soldiers with feelings of guilt. Now let's bullet point some information about the structure. So the poem is in the form of a dramatic monologue, so we get a real insight into the personal experience and thoughts of an individual, but we could also apply this to other soldiers who have suffered in a similar way. It's two-part in its structure. Remember, the first part of the poem focuses our attention on the event from the soldier's past, where he and his unit shot dead a looter, and then the second part of the poem focuses our attention on the aftermath of the war, and that idea that even though he's home and away from the war, he can't escape the horrors of that day. We have a repeated phrase. We have probably armed, possibly not repeated in this poem, and that reinforces the idea that memories are inescapable, and he's stuck in this never-ending cycle of torment. There is also rhythm break in this poem. So the rhythm of remains and the lack of rhyme is designed to show the nature of the speaker's suffering. And Armitage uses the fact that the last two lines break from the pattern of four-line stanzas to represent the individual's mental disintegration. The lack of rhyme not only gives the monologue a more natural, speech-like feel, but could indicate the speaker's unstable state of mind as well. And the regular pattern of stanzas could reflect the ongoing, relentless, never-ending suffering of the soldier. Okay, now I'd like you to focus your attention on the title. Consider the questions that are on screen, pause the video, jot down your ideas, and then when you're ready, press play. So remains has negative connotations of death, something unwanted or something left over. So that could indicate for us that all that is left of the speaker's life is his guilt, or it could indicate that he is now just a shell of his former self. Now let's start to take a look at some of the language that Armitage has used. Firstly, focus your attention on another occasion and, well, myself and somebody else and somebody else. What effect does the use of this colloquial, casual language have on the reader? Pause the video to give yourself time to gather some thoughts and then press play again when you're ready. So this shows us that the experience, such as the one that's being described, were common, and that the soldiers were almost desensitized to the horror when they were immersed in it. Now focus in on the repeated use of the noun looter. Why do you think this vague language has been used? What's the effect? Pause the video to give yourself time to think and then press play again when you're ready. So this could show us how the soldiers dehumanized those who they attacked, and that they may have done this to make it easier to deal with the taking of another human's life. And now take a look at these colloquial or casual verbs, tosses and carted off. What's the effect of those casual verbs? Pause the video again to take the time you need to jot down some ideas, and then press play again when you feel ready. So these colloquial verbs, they really indicate for us the soldier's lack of respect and lack of regard for human life in war. And now take a look at the repeated use of sensory language, I see, I see. What effect does this have? Again, pause the video and press play when you're ready. So this for us really conveys a sense of the trauma that is caused for the soldier. It's that it's branded on his memory, and the use of present tense here relates to the idea that the suffering is ongoing, and it suggests that he's constantly replaying the memories. And now let's look at the phrase rips through his life. What effect does that violent language have? Again, pause the video and play when you're ready. So that violent language really highlights for us the brutality of the attack. Now take a look at the use of the uncertain language on line 4 with probably armed, possibly not. What does the use of that uncertain language suggest to you? Pause the video to give yourself time to think and then press play again when you feel ready. So this really reminds us, doesn't it, of the doubt that the soldier must deal with and links through to that theme of guilt. There's that indication that the man who has been killed maybe shouldn't have been. And let's also take a look at this really gruesome imagery, sort of inside out, pain itself, the image of agony. What's the effect of that gruesome imagery? Pause the video to give yourself time to gather some thoughts and then press play when you're ready. Yeah, this gruesome imagery really indicates the reality of war. That lack of glory, lack of honour, normally associated with such a job. And now let's take a look at the use of metaphor with his blood shadow stays. So I think this really creates an image of an idea of something that's dark, something that lingers. And if we break it down a little bit further, if we think about blood relating to death and shadow relating to the memory that lingers, he's constantly reminded of what he did. And then the idea that this constant memory of what he did bursts on him. So we've got to use this violent verb, really highlighting for us how the image erupts into his mind without any warning. And we have use of a short sentence here with caesura, with end of story. I think there's that sense, isn't there, that the speaker really believed that the memories would remain at war when he left, but this really could reflect that stark, sudden realization that he will continue to be haunted by them. And then we have the line, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. So here I think we're getting a real sense of the desperation that the speaker is feeling to rid himself of these haunting memories. Focus in on the word flush, okay? I'd like you to consider the use of that verb and its connotations, and pause the video to give yourself time to do that and then press play when you feel ready. What does flush mean? What does that have connotations of? So yeah, flush suggests that it's something that needs to be cleansed from him or disposed of, and that really links through to that unpleasantness of his memories. Now listen to this line. Not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land. I'd like you to consider the use of sibilants and alliteration there and its effect. Pause the video to give yourself time to do that and then press play when you're ready. So here I think the use of that sibilance and that harsh sound really suggests for us that he's spitting out these words, which really conveys his anger and frustration. And here in this final couplet, we have our speaker overwhelmed with feelings of guilt. I'd like you to consider the use of that bloody imagery and repetition of bloody on that final line. What does that reinforce a sense of? Pause the video to give yourself time and then press play when you're ready. So the repetition of bloody, it really reinforces the sense of his frustration, and the image of having blood on his hand symbolises the guilt he's unable to rid himself of. Bloody could also be interpreted as a swear word and mark his anger or regret. Let's Let's have a look at Armitage's further use of contrast in this poem. So we start on line 1, we have the use of a collective pronoun we, which really serves to remind us that soldiers act as a unit in war. And then if you contrast that with the final line, where you have the singular pronoun my being used, that there reinforces the idea that the soldier is now left to deal with his guilt on his own. Here we have further contrast with sleep and dream and torn apart by a dozen rounds. So think about sleep and dream having connotations of peace and tranquility, and then that's contrasted with that violent image of being torn apart by a dozen rounds. So everyone, I hope that lesson has really helped you with your understanding of the poem and that you have some great annotations done. If in the future you're asked to compare this poem regarding reality of conflict or effects of conflict, you may wish to compare it to War Photographer, Exposure, Poppies, Bayonet Charge or Charge of the Light Brigade. However, if you're asked to compare this poem regarding powerful memories, you may wish to compare it to Kamikaze, Poppies, The Emigre, War Photographer or The Prelude. Or if you're asked to compare this poem regarding powerful, memorable and or unpleasant experiences, you may wish to compare it to Exposure, Charge of the Light Brigade, Bayonet Charge or The Prelude. On the next couple of slides, you'll find the tasks that your teacher might well direct you to complete, or if not, you may wish to complete some of them independently. This is one of the tasks that you either will be directed to complete by your teacher or that you may wish to complete independently. Which poem do you think fits best with remains? And once you've come up with that, I'd like you to draw a big Venn diagram and consider the similarities and differences between each poem. Or you might be directed to complete an exam style question by your teacher, or again, you may wish to complete one of these independently.